In this video, I will discuss my 10-layer AI investment infrastructure that will guide you through the next layer of technology and innovation. I'm a mechanical engineer with further academic inclination in finance. I have been in markets for the past 10 years. I managed to pick Palantir in single digits when the Ukraine war was started and the Fed was aggressively cranking up interest rates. I pick NVIDIA, Tesla, Bitcoin, Solana before pandemic, all of them. And I use the same model. Towards the end, I will also give you one stock that I am personally building a position aggressively at the time of recording. So the model is known as the highway model. You have to identify three things: the road, the traffic, and the gas station, and the small tuck shops next to it. So to understand it better, let's go back to the 4G era. Your digital highway was 4G network. The car passing were the traffic. The users and the businesses that profited the most were the tuck shops and the gas stations established next to it. Telcos, Verizon, AT&T, Vodafone, Ericsson, Nokia built the 4G highway. They were paid once. That's basically it. Their stock went sideways for decades. And that is because this process was very capital intensive process. Once the infrastructure was established, the real money was made later, not just by the gas stations and the tuck shops, the likes of which Amazon, Netflix, Spotify, Facebook, Apple, and the likes, but also the people who picked these infrastructure stocks later. Remember, all these fibers that were laid down and the work that were done, they went dark for a long time before the demand catches up. Picking these gas stations, these were the brands or the products that the traffic could not avoid. They were always going to be the recurring revenue coming from these businesses, which compounds for decades on end. So the whole game is one line: find the highway, ignore the cars, and hold the gas stations that will make you recurring revenue for a long, long time. This model applies to AI infrastructure as well, but slightly in a different way. Now, here the infrastructure is the recurring revenue. The infrastructure needs to be built, upgraded again and again. As long as we have the new chips coming in and new models, the infrastructure needs to be upgraded, and it is well defined by the Moore's law. Remember, when we have these old cars, they used to have 9, 10, or 15 sensors at max. Once my dad told me that it was 10 to 15 to 20 chips at best, and a very luxury car back in the 80s, these 90s. Now it's like, wait a second, the modern cars have what, like 1,000 sensors? Imagine if Tesla have so much chips in it, like north of 10,000 or something like that. How many chips will a smart home have, which is inevitable? How much chips will this new AI infrastructure, this new upgrade of technology have? And the demand is only going to go up. The infrastructure that maintained by the likes of NVIDIA, Qualcomm, TSMC, and all these hyperscalers, models comes and go. Honestly, from an investment point of view, this is just bullshit. You should just put your money in the infrastructure, which will stand the test of time and which will far outlast the bubble that is in making. The money used to sit at the top of the stack in the app layer, on the 4G innovation. In AI, it moves to the bottom, into the roadside. If you miss that one shift, you can spend the whole cycle betting on the wrong thing. This is true in quantum, in all the other layers that will come. So, if the infrastructure is the price, we need to know exactly what it is, layer by layer. Let's define the infrastructure with the 10-layer model that I've created. So, you can see this goes from critical minerals and rare earth minerals all the way to the cybersecurity on the top, and critical layers being the layer 0 and the cybersecurity being the top of the pyramid. Top is the most unstable here and less sticky. So let's start this one by one and define it and explain it in depth. So critical minerals, your layer 0. The inputs are copper for wiring and grid, uranium for nuclear power, rare earth for magnets and motors, high purity quartz for crucibles, glow, silicon, plus lithium, gallium, germanium. A large share of the world's high purity quartz comes from a single deposit in North Carolina. If you remove that from the puzzle, the chip industry has a problem. Now, from the investment point of view, you have to look for the bottlenecks where the demand exceeds the supply, and those are the corners where you're going to make the most money. Let's continue with this analysis. This is where geopolitics comes into play. Recently, when Trump was trying to put tariffs on China, we all remember how that works out. China was the only country that could fight back, and most of that has come to its absolute total monopoly over the rare earth minerals. Rare earth itself is not very rare, but China has built a whole manufacturing process, and they thought about that since 1990. They were thinking almost 3 decades ahead of time. Most of these materials mentioned here deserve a video of their own. The second one we will do will be on the uranium, and you will see the bottlenecks there. We will do that later, but for now, names to be remembered from the investment point of view, I'm looking at mostly American stock because that's where we are investing. MP Material is an American only fully integrated rare earth producer with capabilities spanning the supply chain from mining and processing to advanced metallization and magnets infrastructure. An Australian mining company, Linus Rare Earth, is the only one that operates outside China, apart from MP Material, and that's an Australian company, and that is available to invest. Then comes the crux of it. It is called the lithography, or Layer 1. It is one company that controls the entire advanced AI manufacturing that exists. So ASML is in Netherlands. It is a company that produces the machines that produces the chips. So ASML is the only company on earth that can make extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. The system that patterns silicon at the smallest scale. The low NA machine costs 180 to 200 million euro each, and the high NA machine costs about 350 to 380 million euros each. So, what is the moat here? The moat here, it is the experience accumulated over 2 decades and more than 9 billion euros invested in research and development. They have the advantage of the supply chain, Zeist Optics and Cymer Light Source. They will face major challenges to rebuild it from scratch, right? Nikon and Canon, the two giants who rule this market, fell out of the EUV race entirely. One by choice and one shut out because they couldn't compete. China has worked on a substitute for 15 years and they are still about 5 years behind. When I say 5 years, that's about 2.5 Moore's Law behind. The order books for ASML are about 38.8 billion euro, roughly a full year of revenue already paid in deposits. Then come the question of China revenue. China's revenue is normalizing for a stockpiling peak of 42% of sales back to 20% in 2026 now. Why this matters? Because when China was banned out of the high EUV machines by the previous Trump administration, China started accumulating and buying the lower end as much as they can. That's called DEUV. That has now been normalized. But that is not lost. ASML predict that the revenue will not fall because the demand from TSMC, Samsung, and Intel fill that gap. And this is a national security thing. So the CHIP Act backed Intel heavily in this thing. ASML is a choke point that the United States want to have control of. All the export rules to China, all the export bans goes through this one company. As the world splits into the block, ASML strategic values go up. The more the conflict escalates or this polarization of the world happen, the more it will benefit TSMC because it strategically positions extreme importance. This can be out innovated. That's the only way to compete with them. What China have done with EVs, as they never went into the gas production or gas ICE engines because they know they cannot compete. So that is the risk, but that's far in the future. But we will cover that in a different video. So now let's move to the layer number 2, the computer design. This is where everybody is obsessed with it, right? Everybody's concentrating on this. The mighty, fabulous chip designers are dominated by the US heavyweights like NVIDIA, AMD, along with custom ASIC designers like parallel to that, a rising Chinese stack. But again, it's a bit behind with the chips of Huawei and out innovating some of the American competitors are definitely a threat, but it hasn't catch up yet. But none of these companies actually produce a single chip. They produce basically nothing. They hand the blueprint to a foundry to build these things. NVIDIA holds about 80 to 85% of the data center AI chip market, down from 92% in 2023. The chip is the visible product, but the real moat NVIDIA has is CUDA or CUDA, the software an entire generation of developers build their careers on. CUDA only run on NVIDIA hardware. That is the single biggest moat they have. So they have to retrain the whole thing, and it's a disaster. Jensen Han was pointing out that when we don't sell our chips to China, we also miss out on the opportunities of all these engineering training their AI on our chips, and that's a net loss to NVIDIA, but politics gets the best of it. This is the most crowded layer in the entire stack. Every hyperscaler is now building its own chips. Google, TPU, Amazon, Trainium, Microsoft, Mia, and Meta is Meta or MTIA. When Midjourney move its workload from NVIDIA GPU clusters to Google Cloud TPU E6 pods, its monthly bill fell from around 2.1 million US dollars to 700,000, a staggering 65% cut in the cost. The entire immigration took around 11 days. An analyst project NVIDIA's interference share could fall from about 90% today to 20 to 30% by 2028. While NVIDIA retain its crown in AI training, specialized competitors are closing in on the highest stake, fast-paced interference market. NVIDIA's share is decreasing from 90% or 80% to 20 to 30%. That doesn't mean NVIDIA would make less money. The broader market is expanding, also known as TAM or TAM. My favorite name in this layer is Broadcom. Broadcom co-designed the custom chips for Google, Meta, and others with Marvell. It controls about 95% of the custom AI chip market, from alone around 70%, with a backlog over 70 billion US dollars. Whether NVIDIA wins or hyperscaler chip take the crown. In my view, Broadcom get paid either way. It is the picks and shovels supplier to the picks and shovel suppliers of the industry. Then there is a wild card, recently IPO'd Cerebras. Which just went public in 2026, it turns an entire wafer into a one chip the size of a dinner plate. 4 trillion transistors built for fast interference. It's landed a 20 billion capacity deal with OpenAI. Now it is given that OpenAI survived a lot of reservation on the way OpenAI is operating, and we'll find out. Who knows? But its revenue is concentrated in few customers, some in the Middle East, and it is still losing money. So I see it as a high risk tactical bet, not a core holding, not a financial advice. But then again, gone are the days when people used to bet on the companies that were actually making money. These are mostly losing money anyway. Let's talk about China. Alibaba's T-Head is building a real domestic chip, improving fast, but they are built at SMIC, which cannot access EUV. So they can match older NVIDIA parts, but not the Frontier. Now, Huawei have recently built one that has matched H200, which is quite a leap forward, but they're still behind. Without ASML, China builds good chip, but not the best one. Designing the chip is one thing, but building is another. And it comes down to one island and one island alone. And that is where we will go to layer 3. Layer number 3, fabrication and packaging. NVIDIA designs the chips, but owns 0 factories. The manufacturing happens in the foundries. A leading edge fab costs over 20 billion and takes about 4 to 5 years to build. The process knowledge inside cannot be copied or hired. You have to spend a decade learning it. The first name that comes to mind, and the household name, that's TSMC. TSMC makes 90% of leading edge production at 3 nanometer and below. Every NVIDIA H100, B100, B200, and the new Rubin is built there. To sustain this dominance and satisfy NVIDIA's insatiable demand, TSMC lifts its annual capital expenditure, CapEx, to a record $52 to $56 billion. Samsung is the only other leading edge player, but its yield lag and it competes with its own customers. So this is very important to mention. When TSMC was founded by its founder, he made a promise that TSMC will only and only manufacture chips. They will not design anything. Samsung, on the other hand, have a fab which is losing money, but the bigger problem is that they are in competition with their customer. So it's very hard for NVIDIA to trust them or for any other competitors. So TSMC is basically one of the only manufacturer only company out there. Samsung wins some NVIDIA order, but not for its cutting edge design. There's no way. SMIC in China is pushing for self reliance, but it's behind. Blocked from EUVs, and Intel is the only Western headquarter leading edge foundry backed by the Biden's CHIP Act. So they are guaranteed to get a lot of orders. It is a binary bet. In a bad Taiwan scenario, Intel become one of the most valuable company on earth overnight. Let's talk about Taiwan risk. About 90% of the world's most advanced chips are made within 800 miles of the most contested strait on the planet. If something were to happen there, the supply chain does not slow down, it completely collapses. You cannot avoid it by avoiding TSMC because NVIDIA and AMD and Apple and Broadcom all depends on it. So owning TSMC is not an extra risk, it is the exposure to the risk that you already have. Intel is the only thing that can hedge it. Will they meet that demand right off the bat? Probably not, but that's also a good thing in that scenario. Now, let's talk about the hidden bottleneck. There's a lot of bottlenecks here. A modern AI chip is not one piece of silicon. It is a GPU die plus several memories stacks glued together in one package. COWS, chips on wafer on substrate, is the dominant packaging technology, and for 2 years straight, NVIDIA's chip supply has been capped by packing capacity, not by the chip fabrication. So, in other words, manufacturing is not a problem, it is the packaging. So, TSMC double capacity every year and still cannot keep up. Intel has the hedge. In packaging, we have SE technology based in Taiwan. That's the competitor to TSMC, and Amkor, based in Tampa, Arizona, United States, and BASI, the Dutch company that makes packaging machines. These are the cleanest and pure play for advanced packaging. This is where these little bottlenecks, when you understand this infrastructure, these little bottlenecks is where you can make the most money. Advanced packaging, not transistor scaling, is the primary bottleneck in modern semiconductor performance. That is very important to understand because this is a bottleneck that you can exploit for profit. One of the things being glued on to the chip is the memory, which bring us to layer number 4. Layer number 4 is its memory. You can have the most powerful GPU on earth, but without enough memory bandwidth, it is a supercar stuck in traffic. Raw GPU power is useless without data velocity. That velocity required HBM, a critical bottleneck controlled by just 3 global companies. HBM is different from its predecessors. It is a memory stack vertically next to GPU and thousands of connections running between the dies. You can think of this as a fuel line. SK Hynix is a company based out of South Korea, a leader in this space, controlling about 62 to 4% of the market, and the primary supplier of NVIDIA. For the first time ever, it beat Samsung in annual profit in 2025. Micron is the only US player. Its share jumped from 4% to 21% for the first half in 2025. When the US Department of Defense needs HBM, Micron is preferred given the current geopolitical situation. Samsung Electronics staged a massive comeback from NVIDIA and rigorous qualification for M4, which Jensen Huang has already approved. So that's why you see the dip in the stocks, but these dips are usually opportunities. After falling behind its rivals like SK Hynix and Micron during the HBM3 and HBM3E generation, but there is a different interpretation to that too. Samsung in itself has a foundry business that is lagging, so it is not a pure memory play. The market grew from about $35 billion in 2025 to $100 billion by 2028, so they don't have to worry about stealing market share. The entire pie is going to explode to the upside. Just to put this in prospect, all 3 markets have their 2026 production already sold under contract. So something very different and particular about this market. This is the key to understand. Every new generation of AI chip demand more memory than the previous one. and the demand only intensifies. Imagine a standard market is like a cookie shop. And if cookies get expensive, the bakery buys more ovens, make too many cookies, and eventually has to lower the price to sell them. HBM or high bandwidth memory is completely different. It is like building a luxury skyscraper in a city where space is running out and the tenants are growing at a massive rate. This demand outpaces Foundries capacity. The market cannot find equilibrium. The price curve trends strictly upward. That's where the opportunities are. These chips are useless without two things we take for granted: electricity and a way to stop them from melting. So, layer number 5 is turning out to be the biggest bottleneck of the whole build out. This is power and cooling. Now, for 2 years, the story was about chips shortage, right? That's somewhat behind us for now. The real bottleneck now is electricity, and the United States is lagging behind China on upgrading its grid. That's no secret. So, to put it in context, Microsoft is sitting on about $80 billion of cloud orders it cannot fulfill. Not because it lacks chips, but because it cannot get enough power to the buildings. That is not projected demand. So, that brings to the basic needs, and that is electricity. That basically doesn't exist. A single modern AI data center draw a gigaton or more around the clock. That's close to power consumption of a small city. The current grid infrastructure was never built for this kind of consumption. In other words, a nation cannot software its way out of a power situation. The US of A has been focused on financialization of the economy instead of industrialization since the days of President Bill Clinton. This will be further entertained in the uranium expedition that we will do in the next video. So no real concrete efforts were made to physically upgrade the grid of electricity in decades now. Nuclear is the only viable option that can justify both the demand and climate requirements of the new age. Nuclear is the only source that run around the clock at scale. Constellation Energy and Vistra, the largest competitive operators of nuclear power in the United States, Microsoft signed a 20-year deal to restart 3 Mile Island to feed its data centers. Underneath that, the uranium miners Cameco and Gazprom, the Kazakh nationally owned miner, the largest producers in the world, although uranium mining and supply chains have their own bottlenecks, and that will be entertained further in the next video. The power grid's deeper bottlenecks lies in the physical hardware required to move electricity, creating a massive multi-year backlog for critical manufacturing. GE Vernova serves as the sector's anchor, with its advanced turbine orders sold out throughout the end of the decade. Booked completely throughout the decade, still 2030, right? Production crunch extends globally. Siemens Energy faces similar constraints in Europe, while Eaton and Schneider Electricity struggle to meet soaring demand for specialized switchgears and thermal power systems. Finally, infrastructure giant like Service faces the monumental task of physically installing these massive turbines and wiring them into a grid. Now, let's talk about the heat problem. This is the sublayer. Let's call this a sublayer, 5.5. As a mechanical engineer, this is the problem that interests me the most. A traditional rack that air cooling was built for tops around 40 kilowatts. A modern AI rack runs at 100 to 150 kilowatts, and this will further go up to 300 kilowatts in the next gen. Every volt into the chip comes back as heat. So you are generating 3 to 7 times more heat than the room was designed to remove. Air cooling systems become obsolete. At this temperature, the hardware will cook itself, so the industry is moving to liquid cooling, pumping fluid directly across the chips. This makes direct to liquid chip or DLC cooling and coolant distribution units or CDUs fundamentally mandatory. The leader is Vertex, with close behind is Schneider. This is the boring part of the business, and that is exactly where the money is. The boring part of the business, the companies that electrifies and cool these buildings will collect for decades of recurring revenue. Each of these gets its own video because these are too complex to be explained in this. Once you power and cool tens and thousands chips, you have to wire them together so they act as one brain, which comes to layer number 6, which we will discuss further. Then come layer number 6, networking. For decades, AI center handled north-south traffic, vertical data moving down from server to your screen and back up. AI flipped this completely. Training an AI model required thousands of GPUs to talk sideways to each other hundreds of times a second. This massive machine-to-machine flow is called east-west traffic. At this scale, the networking is no longer just plumbing layer, its speed determines if the entire AI cluster works or stalls. So that brings us to the solution, that is integrated fibers, not individual boxes. The companies with the winning hardware vendors in this category do not just sell a physical switch box, they sell a unified tuned system called a connected fabric that integrates the switches, the internal silicon, and the optics. Vertically, the strongest player owns multiple layers of this hardware stack, and horizontally, the same high speed wiring architecture must seamlessly link chip to chip, rack to rack, and building to building as cluster expands. The multi-billion dollar upgrade cycle is a predictable recurring revenue stream. Every time computing chips get faster, the wiring must be replaced to keep up with the speed. As network speed jumps from 400G to 800G and to 1.6 terabyte on the next gen, traditional copper wire fails and data must move at a lightning speed through fiber optics. This forces data center into a massive generation over generation rebuy of million optical components. So, who owns the biggest pie here? Who get paid? Networking is the least glamorous, most dependable layer of AI boom. Regardless of which AI software wins, the companies supplying the infrastructure always profit. Arista Networks lead in building the physical switches, driven by massive demands from Microsoft and Meta. Broadcom dominates the market for the silicon chips inside those switches, profiting no matter who buys the final box. And then Marvel, specializing in custom networking silicon and co-design proprietary chips for Amazon. Coherent, Lumenton, and FiberNet manufacturing the essential optical components and lasers that turn data into light. So that brings us to layer number 7, the cloud landlords or the hyperscalers. Ignore all the models and the chatbot war. Whoever wins, they all will have to be hosted somewhere. And these 4 companies, you are guaranteed to win. Here it is more like buying a race course than actually betting on the racing horse. The combined 2026 capex of these 4 companies is around $650 to $725 billion in a single year, up about 77% from the year before. That is more than the annual military budget of every NATO country, except the United States combined. Wall Street projected this number to go to $1 trillion in 2027. It is the most concentrated industrial build-out the world has ever seen. However, history is not kind to the infrastructure builders. We'll talk about that more later. Microsoft is at 190 billion capex. The AI first joined Office and Windows, put AI on hundreds and millions of desks, plus the relation with OpenAI. However, that is a little complex at the moment. Not just the relation is weakening, but also the survival of the OpenAI itself is in question. And it indeed is the most expensive layer of all 4. Then comes Alphabet, 185 billion. Google Cloud grew 63% year over year, the fastest of the 4. The only one that owns its whole stack, its own chips, its own model, its own cloud, its own distribution through search and YouTube. That is the leader in AI is Google, which was lagging behind for a while, and then they made a remarkable comeback with Gemini. However, the weakness is that all of it is funded by the search engine and that its very existence is in jeopardy because the AI is really damaging the Google search business. Then comes number 2, Amazon. With 200 billion, the most aggressive capex, and my favorite one, and I think it is the least expensive here, and I'm personally building a position in this at the time of speaking. AWS is the largest cloud, the cheapest with its own silicon and deep ties to Anthropic. The only hyperscaler that has actually turned positive on its capex spending. Then the outlier here is Oracle, the late anchored by $500 billion Stargate project with OpenAI and SoftBank. Higher risk and higher reward. If this one execute, it become the third major AI cloud provider overnight. There is a risk to it, but it's a part of the game. You have to take some risk to make money here. It's not a financial advice. The honest bear case that I would like to entertain a bit. This is the largest CapEx cycle in history, and history is not kind to those who build the infrastructure. For example, telecoms in the 1999 borrowed a fortune to lay the fibers for an internet that came, but the builder went bankrupt in most cases, while the fiber set dark. A lot of people make money on that, but they bought them later, the latecomers of the infrastructure. They have made solid profits on it, but not the one who built it. However, this is a bit different here because the pressure is coming more from the demand side. So, solar in 2010, subsidies flooded in, supply crushed prices, the early manufacturer died even as solar won. Shale in 2014, drillers borrow heavily, producing outrun profits, and oil collapses, right down follows, and the same pattern every time. The fear is that AI revenue arrives slower than the capex commits. The reason I still hold the layer is the demand is already in the numbers. The cloud are growing fast and the orders are real. But be ready for a 30 to 40% chop if the market decides that the build out got ahead of itself. Seems very unlikely at this point. The thesis survived that, and you would have to have a very solid conviction here. So, this is more about your conviction here. Owning the land is one thing, but a raw model on the land is useless until something turn it into a real work, which brings us to layer number 8, the operating layer. Spoiler alert, Palantir lies here. A training model on its own is useless to the government or bank. It's just a dead weight on the server to turn it into a real work. You need a layer that wires it into an internal data, wrapped it into security and compliance, make it table, and point it at a decision. That is the operating layer. The dominant name here is Palantir. It built this plumbing for 20 years, mostly for government before the AI was fashionable. It did not pivot into AI. AI arrived and validated what it had already built. Revenue is growing north of 80% a year at scale with strong margin. There is a measure called the rule of 40. Growth plus margin should clear 40 for a healthy software company. Palantir runs around 145. That is the envy of many software companies. The real mode is the positioning of the Palantir. So Palantir is becoming the operating system of the Western government AI, defense, intelligence, the US Army's Vantage program, Special Operation Command, and Project Maven. No government run classified operation on a public jet, but that's given. That list is really about one company. Now, the warning with this. This is the most expensive name in the framework. Its price to earning ratio is north of 200. If the growth stays extraordinary, you grow into it. And if it stumbles, the stock can halve with the business keep doing fine. Conviction here is whether the company is good. It is how you pay and how much you hold. Position sizing matters more here than on any other name. For me, I was buying Palantir down in single digits in 2022 when the war in Ukraine and the Fed's rate hike had hammered almost nearly everything across the board. Not a financial advice, just where my conviction sat. At the moment, it seems probably expensive, but if you can hold it for long enough, might do wonders. The commercial cousin of this is software now, which I was talking in the beginning, where I am trying to build my positions here. It does the ordinary enterprise what Palantir does for the state, embedding AI into corporate workflow with a 98% renewable rate that shows how sticky it is. Less drama and less geopolitical hassle, but clear and more diversified business. It reminds me of Palantir in the early days. This is not a financial advice, it's my personal position. I'm building in it. If it works, it works. If it's not, we'll find out. But the financial looks pretty solid. Palantir is the operating layer of the government. ServiceNow is the operating layer of corporation. Finally, the layers that protect all of us, and one layer I refuse to marry. That's layer number 9. Security is very important indeed, but it is not a very sticky service. You change security quite often. As AI get woven into banks, hospital grids, and the government, the case for security writes itself. More AI everywhere means more to protect. These are great businesses with real recurring revenue. And yet, this is the one layer that I keep at arm's length. Knowing what not to hold forever is as much as a part of this framework as knowing what to buy and hold forever. Again, reason number two. First, weaker moat. A company switches its cybersecurity vendor far more easier than it switches its foundry or its power supply. The second and the biggest concern is the quantum or the CUDA, almost around the corner. CUDA is the expert put it that it will come around 2030, and that could disrupt things seriously. If that happened, only companies that have adjusted to quantum security layer will benefit. Cryptography ground this layer stands on its to be rebuilt. And that kind of shift tend to crown new winners, not reward the incumbents. The names are still strong and have good businesses. Some of them are CrowdStrike in the endpoint security, Zscaler in the zero trust access, Datadog in observability, Cloudflare between security and delivery. So I would personally treat this layer differently. These are the names you'd get for a few years, get the ride, and then get off. I would not keep them as a whole because this to me is the top of the pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, the more shakeable their grounds are and the more easier they are to switch. So only the deepest and the hardest to disrupt layer will earn a permanent place. Everything else has an exit in mind. And that is the beauty of this model. That is all 10 layers. And now let me show you what it looks like as a map of power. Everything have geopolitics in play. So once you see the 10 layers, you see something completely different. Every layer has a flag on it. The AI stack is a map of 21st century power structure. Lithography sits in the Netherlands, fabrications in Taiwan, 90% of it within 100 miles of the contestant strain. Memory in Korea and mineral processing in China. Energy runs through Russia, the Gulf, and the Strait of Hormuz, where about 20% of the oil passes through 2-mile wide channel. Even at the height of the sanctions, Washington moved carefully around Russian enriched uranium. Russia supplies about 25% of the fuel that feeds American reactors, and a fleet built around that supply cannot switch it off. A ban passes, but with waivers running to 2028. The dependency is real and the unwinding will take years, but I think even after 2028, they won't do anything because everything depends on it. The whole infrastructure is set for that. It's going to create, the war is going to stop before that, and the politician is going to kick the can down the next generation. Then there is Japan at the two end of the stack at once. On energy, it is the most exposed major economy on earth. It imports about 95% of its oil from the Middle East, and 75 to 90% of that passes from Strait of Hormuz. This is something to pay close attention to. Make another video on that, click it on top left. You can watch that. I was in Danish embassy in Japan, and we were on an academic trip, and we were briefed by one of the Japan's official who was in charge of their renewable energy. It made me realize how much the country's energy security hangs on one small waterway. And they have close to zero plan for the renewables. So it is a little bit worrying from the Japan side. I really don't understand why they cannot fix this problem and move further into the renewables. Of course, they have certain challenges, but nevertheless, nothing is impossible. Japan is the largest foreign holder of the US debt. The quite financiers behind the American bond market, one country vulnerable on energy at the bottom and indispensable on capital. President Trump has floated the idea for Japan to buy American gas. However, that money is usually parked in American treasury bonds. If they have to buy oil or gas from the US, they have to sell American treasuries. Long story short, line the layers up and a chain appears in 5 steps. Resource control, who have the input, industrial control, who builds the stack, and technological control, who set the standards, and financial control, who provides the capital, and strategic control, who holds the leverage. The leverage here is more of bottlenecks. Whoever owns more links in the chain owns the next century. The future belongs to those who controls the bottlenecks. So then the question arrives, how do I actually use this layer? How do I rank it? A framework without discipline is just a diagram. Not every layer earns a permanent place in a portfolio, so I rank them for the sake of understanding. The spine, the layer I would hold for decades, are the one with deepest physical moats. and the cleanest economics, where it does not matter which models wins. For example, lithography, power and cooling, the cloud landlords, and critical materials at the base. Below them sits the strong but cyclical layers, memory and fabrication. I hold them with eyes open to the volatility and geopolitics. The most hype layered of all are computer design. I treat them with caution because it is the most crowded and most prized for perfection. And security, I keep tactical, not permanent, because quantum could reset its mode. Now, I'm keeping a special eye on quantum computation and the whole mode. How would it evolve? We will do a whole thesis like this one on quantum as well. Notice what that means. The most talked about corner of AI investment is the one I'm most passionate about. The layers nobody mentioned are the ones I back the hardest. The gap between what the crowd watches and what actually compounds is the whole reason this works. I'm not here in the business of telling you what to buy. I'm here in the business of showing you how to think in systems and see for yourself. I want you to make your decision. The cars on the highway change every year. The model of the month will change every quarter. The infrastructure underneath does not. It compounds for decades on end. ASML will keep shipping machines. TSMC will be building chips. The memory storage keeps tightening. The turbine stays solid. The cloud landlords keep collecting rent. And we keep getting richer. Models are noise, infrastructure is the game. Each of these layers get its own deep dive video. Subscribe so you don't miss. The full written breakdown with every name and ticker is on my Substack, linked below. None of this is financial advice. Do your own work and your own research, and I will see you on the next one. Over and out.